Good morning and welcome everyone to the latest edition in our Mackinac Center series of online events. Today we're discussing school at home and the opportunities available for Michigan families looking forward to the next school year. I'm Joe Milligan. I'm a director of strategic partnerships here at the Mackinac Center, and this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because I spent most of my education as a homeschooler. I did a short stint in private school and a short stint in public school, but mostly it was in homeschool, and I greatly enjoyed that. And I'm looking forward to what our panelists have to say here today. And it's also a very timely topic because, of course, schools were forced to switch to a virtual learning environment at the end of last school year in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And going forward now, they're trying to make the very difficult decision of whether they're going to be doing the next school year in person, whether they're going to continue on with their pivot towards virtual education or some hybrid of the two, or whatever the case might be. So we have a great panel lined up for you today. We have Director of Education Policy at the Mackinac Center, Ben DeGrow, who joined us in 2015 after a long stint at Colorado's Independence Institute, where he provided expert analysis on school choice, school finance, collective bargaining, and education employment policies. He's authored numerous policy reports and articles for various publications, as well as for the Mackinac Center itself, and has appeared regularly on radio and television and before legislative committees. Welcome. Good morning, Ben. We're also joined by Deana Garcia, who's a mother of a 17-year-old daughter who attends the virtual Highpoint Virtual Academy, which is based in Michigan but has students in several different states. Her daughter has attended Highpoint for 2 years, and she's also taken advantage of the early middle college program that they offer in conjunction with Baker College. So thank you for being with us, Deana. We're also joined by Leanne Van Beek, who's been hybrid educating her 3 children, who are 12, 10, and 8, since 2013. And currently, she's held leadership roles at a regional and national organization and ran a consulting business that served local, state, and national clients. She's found this challenging, but has enjoyed most everything about maintaining full-time employment, as well as taking the lead in educating her children from home. And she started a homeschool co-op in 2014 that they still participate in. So I don't know how Leanne found time to be here today, but we're very, very grateful that she did. And she began homeschooling at the encouragement of her husband, and it sounds like she's really enjoyed the freedom and efficiency that's offered them as a family. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. And to kick things off, we're actually going to have a word from Mackinac Center President Joe Layman. Joe's an engineer by training. He joined the Mackinac Center in 1995, was named president in 2008, and during his tenure, the Mackinac Center has grown tremendously, and as a result, Michigan has seen numerous free market policy advances in education, labor, and state fiscal affairs. Joe has frequently been published in national and state media. He's also trained more than 600 public policy executives internationally on strategic leadership and communications. He and his wife are the founders of Midland County Habitat for Humanity. And Joe, it also strikes me that you're a homeschool dad as well.
That's right, Joe, and it's one reason I'm very glad that we're able to put on today's show. There's so many people expressing interest right now in different options for educating their kids. And my wife, Karen, and I educated all 4 of our children all the way through at home from kindergarten and now into now they're off to college this year for our 18-year-old, the youngest, will be going to college this fall. So this has great personal interest to me as well as professional interest. And we've got a great turnout today, and I want to thank all the Mackinac Center supporters for tuning in and for maintaining support and interest in times that none of us really quite know how to deal with from prior experience. But now what we've learned is when there's a global pandemic and the governor assumes extraordinary executive powers, a public policy think tank is busier than ever before. It doesn't mean that fewer people have time to think about policy work. It means that attention is through the roof on all of the policy issues that her emergency powers in the pandemic are touching. And web traffic to the Mackinac Center's main news site, Capital Confidential, has more than tripled. And if I remember the report from over the weekend, we even had a 500,000 views of our news stories over the weekend. And so that's really an extraordinary level of interest in our material. But our work in all policy areas goes on thanks to the great support of our supporters. Yesterday, we released a report on corporate welfare, and Michigan has a long history. We looked at programs going back to 1983, and there were 9 major corporate welfare programs. Only 3 of them had any statistically significant impact on job growth at all. And even then, the jobs that they claimed to have created cost more than $600,000 per job. And so we continue to study this issue and continue to recommend that Michigan get out of the corporate welfare business and instead focusing tax relief on a few select firms. Spread that tax relief around for everyone, because the government has not done a very good job picking winning companies and losing companies. We've also been working very hard to educate unionized government workers across the whole country on the rights that they now can exercise under the Janus Supreme Court decision 2 years ago. That decision essentially made all government unionized workers in the country the same as if they lived in a right-to-work state. They could no longer be fired for refusing to support a union. And so the Mackinac Center has been educating them in many jurisdictions, including very large ones, including California, Pennsylvania. Drops in union dues paying have been 10% or more. And there was a time when the pandemic was beginning to be felt that unionized workers were not very interested in our messages there, but we fine-tuned the messaging and now they're looking for ways to see if asking themselves the question: can they spend that money better, or should they hand it over to a union that may or may not represent their interests well? And my last policy update for you is that I hope you will pay attention to the Michigan Supreme Court on September 2nd. On that day, the Mackinac Center will be presenting oral arguments in a challenge of Governor Whitmer's use of her emergency powers. In this case, we're representing the medical providers and some patients who have been denied the medical care that they needed to remain healthy. And the use of the governor's emergency powers actually prevented medical workers from working and caused some people with health problems to experience greater health problems. We're representing them in a challenge to that part of her powers. And so we'll have an update for you after September 2nd. But again, I just want to thank the tremendous support from friends of the Mackinac Center. We're 33 years old this year, and it's really this is the moment that the Mackinac Center was created for, in a time of crisis when policymakers know that there's a serious independent policy research shop out there to provide free market ideas. So, Joe, back to you to have some more conversation about education.
Thanks for that, Joe. And now we'll dive right into the conversation here. But first, I want to let you know that if you have any questions, there is a Q&A column on the right-hand side. Feel free to type in your questions there as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. But it's our hope that parents will come away from this feeling a little bit more well-equipped to make an informed decision for what their children are going to be doing leading into the fall and beyond. As well as a more clear idea of what the policy landscape is going to look like for K through 12 education here in Michigan. So if we can clarify anything or if there's anything on your mind, please feel free to just type that right into the question column right there. And we'll get into it right now with Ben. And Ben, I want to ask you, because schools pivoted to virtual learning at the end of last year, or the last school year, do we have any idea how well that worked at all, or what the results were from that?
That is the great question of the hour, and I've been asked that several times. You have to keep in mind, put this in context, that under normal conditions, it's kind of hard to tell exactly how well public education is performing. We have standardized tests that give us some indication of students' ability to master things like math and language arts and other academic subject matter. That gives us some of a picture of how well it's working. But if we go back and take a journey back in time, remember one of the first things that happened when the pandemic started was our governor and our state superintendent and other education officials pushing and asking for the standardized tests be suspended for the year. So we don't have any data on how much students really learned over that last spring term. We do have a good sense, though, that by and large, this was not a good experience for most students. You can look, first of all, at how parents responded. A couple of statewide surveys found 64% parents who were there in person watching their kids deal with this remote instruction were concerned about the quality that they were getting. And larger numbers were saying that the quality of education was lower than normal. And if you remember that, and again, under normal conditions and normal times, Michigan was already in the news for being one of the lowest performing states educationally, with serious implications for the kids' futures, for business, for all sorts of things. And so 37% of parents saying the remote learning was even lower. It's definitely problematic. We did have a national survey that we can assume that Michigan is similar to how districts respond in generally, then it would be a pretty disturbing trend. And that is a group called the Center on Reinventing Public Education out of Seattle, Washington, surveyed hundreds of districts around the country. They found 2/3 of those districts provided no meaningful instruction. In other words, teachers were not engaged with students' academic progress, were not providing them any feedback on their academic work. So it appears that the majority of districts in Michigan were doing a poor job of delivering that education.
So, Deana, your daughter attends an online virtual academy. So, a lot of parents, after having this virtual schooling experience at the end of last year, where the school system really wasn't prepared for that and nobody knew going into the semester that they were going to have to do that, it was a real challenge. And so maybe parents have a little bit of a bad taste left in their mouth from that. My question for you is, what sets apart a quality online education like the one that your daughter receives, and what sort of questions should parents be asking when they're evaluating whether an online curriculum is right for them and their children?
One of the first things I would suggest to a parent is, just like you would tour a school or a college, is ask for a tour. See what kind of resources they have available, how easy it is to manipulate. We were so incredibly pleasantly surprised by what Highpoint Virtual Academy offered us in terms of those resources. It's very easy for any of us to navigate, to participate in a classroom or a discussion. All meetings that you hold with the teacher or principal or anyone you need to deal with is all pushed to you, just like if you're attending a class. It's very easy to get on, see what's going on. So they offer great resources. We were also very pleasantly surprised. We, in terms of materials, not only are your books shipped to you, but a laptop, headset, printer, all the tools that our daughter needed to be successful with school, and kind of even better tools that she has to herself to be able to use during this time. We also get, there's a lot of one-on-one support. I hear her talking to her teachers and interacting with her teachers much more one-on-one than she did in a traditional school. She was in the public schools up through 10th grade or the beginning of 10th grade. So that has been really an incredible difference for her, where she's very comfortable. And we find her getting more involved in her education because of that, because she's much more comfortable in this environment. We also, the early middle college program that you mentioned in the introduction has been a great asset too. My daughter's been attending classes also online through Baker College, and she will stay in school one extra year and will come out with an associate's degree. Highpoint Virtual Academy schedules those classes for us. They do all the interaction with Baker. We don't even hardly engage with the school other than for her to attend the classes. So that's been super great. And a lot of the schools, I think, our concern was what would happen to her with the extracurricular activities, the social interaction, how we would adjust in that environment. And honestly, there are so many different clubs that she can join. She's in drawing clubs, she's in student council, she's in National Honor Society. They had a prom. They host coffee club. We get together with students from the school. So there's a lot, I think, that people don't understand that these schools have available. And obviously, when the public schools had to quickly set up, none of that is in place. But, these online charter schools offer, I think, a lot more resources and ability to support your child than most people understand.
Sure. And Ben, I want to jump back over to you and ask, so what are local and state officials doing right now to prepare for the upcoming year? I know there's a lot of question marks. What does the landscape look like big picture right now?
Yeah, great question. And this really is crunch time. We're less than a month away from even the latest school districts having to start right after Labor Day. All the usual routines have been disrupted, and everybody's kind of waiting. The local officials are waiting to see what the state officials are going to do, and state officials are trying to deal with some legislation. They're also trying to figure out what the public health situation is. And so we have a complex situation going on, but we have competing plans. So the governor has put out her roadmap. She put that out back in July, which recommends that if the state is back at phase 3, under her description of the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, that all schools have to go to remote instruction. Right now, most of the state's on phase 4. And phase 4 is kind of this weird middle ground where a lot of extra measures are recommended for schools that have in-person programming, things like temperature checks or masks for some students in certain situations, more spacing between desks and spacing between kids on buses and things like that. But a lot of it's being left up to the local officials. And right now, we're seeing weak leadership in some places. Some of the larger districts, most of the larger districts have already come out and announced. So under the governor's plan, they have until the end of this week, basically, to finalize their plans and post those so parents know what they are. The ones that have already released the plans, most of the large districts have said, we're just going to start the year on a full-time remote instructional footing. And based on parents' experiences with that distance learning this spring, not instilling a lot of confidence in a lot of places. Now, there are a few districts who are, I think, in tune with what's going on and are trying to create some options for families, but they right now seem to be the minority. We need to be encouraging and creating ways for these districts to be more creative and flexible. And there's some legislation right now in the State House that's really needs to be resolved this week if it's going to be of any value for this year that's put forward, that's going to make it easier for districts to be more flexible in how they meet parents' demands.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is coming down to crunch time. And there's got to be a ton of anxiety among parents right now with not even knowing what they're going to be able to do with themselves and their jobs and their career if they're having to be back in the office or the workplace or whatever the case might be while their child is trying to learn from home. And I guess I'm wondering, are officials taking into account what the parents are saying? Are they listening to them at all?
Right. And so I think this is the real differentiator. I would throw in here that if there's a silver lining to the whole educational process that's taken place as a result of the pandemic, it's the fact that it's kind of compelled parents to be more engaged in their kids' education, to be at home with them while they're learning, to be able to see what their curriculum looks like, to see what their interaction with their teacher looks like. So parents being more involved, observing how well or how not so well their education is going, that's been a reality. But for some districts, I think even here in the Midland area, we're seeing a real effort by the district to say, hey, we're surveying our parents, and I think Midland's typical of some of the smaller districts, some of the medium-sized districts. You know, we're going to survey what they're interested in. We realize that some parents want for whatever reason to continue the virtual option that worked well for them at their home, but many parents are wanting to get back to the in-person model, and then to create even a third option, which is a hybrid, which would be kids are coming into class part of the day, certain grades are coming into the class part of the day, or they're alternating days or something, so there's more space in the classes. So yes, I think some of those districts are. At the same time, we're seeing the teachers union, the Michigan Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers in Michigan follow the lead of their national organization and putting in place kind of really, in some cases, irrelevant and outlandish demands before they're allowed to go back in the classroom. And that's creating a real tension that districts are having to resolve between what their employee unions are asking for and what parents are wanting. And that's only going to get more interesting. And so we want to help parents figure out, in those cases where the districts are bowing to the pressure of the unions rather than the parents, how can they find other options?
Yeah, and for those parents who find themselves in a situation where their children are not able to go back to the classroom, they're looking for some kind of alternative. Give me the big picture view of what the landscape looks like for what each of those options are for them going forward here, and especially here, like we said, crunch time at the last minute. What's out there? What are the options?
So we put together a website here at the Mackinac Center, mischoolatHome.org, because we recognize a lot of parents are asking questions, and they want not only the perspective of other parents that we were hearing from on this panel, but they want some of the links and the resources and the technical information. So a few basic things. I mean, right now, parents through the Schools of Choice initiative, the state has had for more than 20 years. If a neighboring district has space, they can enroll in that district's program. If for example, the district where they live, their virtual program just was not delivering, or they're not getting the kind of service they need, that neighboring district has space, they can enroll in that district's full-time virtual program, or they can find maybe an in-person learning option there. We've already heard a little bit about cyber schools from Deana, Highpoint's being one of about a dozen different online charter schools. These are the schools that, when the pandemic hit, they're used to doing online instruction, they're experienced at it, and they kept on rolling. Some of these schools have limited space and they may be filling up, but we want to point parents to that option. That's a place where you want your kid to learn at home, but maybe you need a little more structure from that perspective. And then there's also private schools are taking in enrollments. That's going to be tuition based, and of course there's homeschooling, which Michigan is one of the more free states when it comes to homeschooling, as far as limited requirements on parents to indicate the desire to homeschool. And they can do that all on their own, or they can enroll as a non-public school. And there's different considerations there. We lay those all out on our website. But we just want parents to realize that if your district isn't up to snuff in what it's doing, then you do have this range of options to fall back on.
Leanne, I want to bring you in here because I know you've been hearing from a lot of different parents who sort of have that anxiety and are starting to just consider schooling their children at home now. And I know you hear from them a lot. So what are some of the myths that you hear about homeschooling, and what sort of realities do you get to enlighten people about and dispel those myths? And what are some of the concerns parents have as they're making that decision going forward?
that I'm qualified to do, and this isn't something that I really fully know the content myself, so how can I possibly teach my children? And so I guess to that, and I think the other piece of that for a lot of people, the reality is I don't think I can homeschool because I also have to work. And so the reality of those two pieces, I would say, are that when it comes to teaching your child, no one knows your child better than you do. And you are educating your child constantly, every day, in other aspects of life skills and values. All you're really adding to a certain extent is this content piece. And I think for parents who are overwhelmed by the idea of, I need to know it and teach it up front, one of the sort of nice realities I've been able to introduce people to is to say, hey, I'm not a history teacher, but I can certainly read through a history textbook with my kids and along the way say, wow, I never knew this. We should look into this further, right? And so learning takes on a slightly different perspective, right? It's an active learning process. It's a participatory learning process. And in many ways, compared to the work world, that's how you will learn for the rest of your life, right? There won't always be someone delivering canned content to you that you either memorize or master and then spit back. So I think it is a life skill that you're teaching them along the way. The other thing is there are also legitimate parts of content that you do need a higher level of understanding of to teach or to really demonstrate well, right? Higher level science and math are pretty easy ones that come to mind. And as Ben and Deana have talked about, there are virtual options for this. There are often cooperative classes for this. So there are ways to sort of parcel some of those things out as you run across them. I think that the second big myth I hear is I have to recreate the classroom, right? Like I was a public school kid myself. I had a good experience. My family, many of them were in public education. So when I began homeschooling, my myth that I had to bust was my kids should be learning from 8:30 until 3:30. I should be teaching 6 different distinct subjects, and that was very overwhelming. The more information I learned about how to homeschool well and how to have more freedom and to trust my instincts, you find that classroom management takes a lot of time during the school day. Many subjects can be taught concurrently in the span of an hour. You might knock out 4 or 5 different subjects in the course of the day. And so you begin to realize that the school day quickly shrinks down to maybe 2 or 3 really consolidated hours. And that speaks to the piece about working. And I think that's an important message for parents to hear is that homeschooling and working can be done. I would never say that it is just an easy walk in the park, something to make that dismissive. But when you start realizing the dynamics of how you can arrange a work and a home schedule, there are a lot of doors that open. And I think my biggest hope is that parents have an understanding that homeschooling is a viable option. Whether they choose it or not, I would like them to not feel like they can't do it. The third myth and the final myth, I think, is the socialization piece that often comes up. People frequently say, how do you socialize your children? And again, for me, I feel like our socialization lens has actually expanded. My kids aren't limited to a group of children who are only their own age. As we participate in groups, as we interact in the community, as they volunteer, sometimes during the school day hours, they're interacting with everyone across multiple generations. And so that's been a huge gift for us. And I think for me, quite a surprising myth to see disappear.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on with that one because I would hear that I was growing up with how do you get socialization? And I would just always turn it back around and say, well, how does a 10-year-old in a room full of 30 other 10-year-olds and one adult ever learn how to be anything but a 10-year-old? And so I think that it's tremendously important there, and you actually get a more robust socialization experience through that. So I think you're absolutely right with that one. So let me ask you, what advice would you give to parents who are considering homeschooling going forward here? And for those parents who are, let's say, maybe a little bit intimidated by the prospect of having to proactively lead their children's education when they've never done that before, getting to a question that was in the Q&A box from Bill Rowerdink, specifically what type of first steps should parents take or resources they should look to as they're beginning to take those first steps into homeschooling, and what type of resources might be out there?
Yes, and Bill, thank you for the question. I think it's a very common one that parents have. I would say that my biggest recommendation is to not get on Facebook and ask 80 different people what they would recommend. Because typically what happens is you'll have 80 different responses of people recommending a curriculum that works for them. And that, I think, overwhelms parents completely. What I would strongly suggest is find someone you know who has been homeschooling and just use them as a mentor the way you would in other aspects of your life. Talk to them about your schedule dynamics, your children's learning dynamics, some of the things that you may prefer to teach more directly or need to parcel out. A seasoned homeschooler is going to have a pretty good idea of what type of curriculum may fit for you and sort of be able to guide you through how to set up your schedules and do some things along those lines. So getting a mentor, I think, is the first and most important thing you can do. It will save you a lot of time. And I think it will also cut down on some of the overwhelming anxiety feeling of, I'm looking at all these resources, but I don't really know what they are. How do I really make my way through them? The other two things I would offer are just more of a mental shift, but I think they're important ones. The first is I hear a lot of parents highly, highly concerned about what's going to happen if I don't teach my kids exactly what the school would have taught them. Will the school let my children back in? How do I make sure they're not falling behind? And I would say that if we were to put that in context, there are situations that happen even in the normal pace of the world when we're not in a coronavirus crisis, where learning is interrupted, right? Children move school districts where maybe they were learning one content in one school and a different set of content in another school. They recover from that. I would challenge parents sometimes to say, what did you learn in fourth grade that you remember? And sometimes we can remember a certain book or a certain study. It's not really about the content they're learning. It's more about the learning experience. And are you building a love of learning? Are you building resourceful learners? Are you taking the opportunity to just let their interests really lead what they're going to learn? There's so much research out there about the efficiency and the long-term effectiveness of interest-led learning, which is not something we get the chance to do typically in a public school classroom. So that would be another recommendation from a mental shift standpoint. And the final one touches on what I said before. I was asked the question many times, what would I do differently if I could go back and restart homeschooling? And the biggest thing I would do is I would not call it school. I would not say it is time to start school. It is time to get your school books out. I think I would reframe the way I'm doing now in saying it's now time for us to learn some math and find out if this sparks you on to a different career or if you realize this is not for you. To recognize learning is happening when your child is learning how to correctly clean a cast iron skillet or make an omelet in the morning, right? There are lots of learning opportunities. Learning should be a rhythm that you and your children just sort of weave into your life. And that takes a lot of pressure off of trying to do, I think, the more traditional classroom model that a lot of us are conditioned to and used to. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we do know that not every family, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for families who are looking for flexibility in the future for their children. And so, Deana, I wanted to ask you, families who need additional structure in their schooling will be looking for that online experience that you and your daughter are having. And how have you and your daughter benefited from the option that you guys have chosen for your individual circumstance with the online schooling?
Yeah, flexibility was a big driving factor for us, but we really based our initial decision. We had a bullying problem with our daughter in a traditional school, and what we found started to happen with her, our daughter has epilepsy, and she actually started developing seizures because she was stressed out about worrying about what was going to happen in between classes and with other students. And we recognized that her ability to learn was really being compromised because she was worried about everything going on around her. And then additionally, that flexibility then, as we looked at it, really played into our decisions because of her illness. In a traditional school, when I would have to pull her out for doctor's appointments, and or she would have a seizure and have to come home. She missed all that learning. That was the end of her learning then for that day, and it was kind of on us to try to help her get it caught up. In the online learning school, we just she watches the class when she gets home or when she wakes up or when she feels better. So I feel like, she never really has to miss school. So that flexibility has been incredible. Not really as much from a flexibility standpoint, but one thing we've thought and talked a lot about this because our oldest daughter was a teacher for several years. And in talking about how it was different, what our experience was versus what the public school experience was, is I also find that when she's working on a computer and interacting with her teachers and answering everything, online, there's a lot of data that teacher gets about my daughter. She or he knows exactly where she's proficient, where she's struggling, where she's not, getting the questions on the test are not coming to her. So I see the teachers really tailoring the discussion to her to help her learn those aspects that maybe she's not comprehending or she's missed. And then sometimes we even, I would suggest to her when she's struggling on something to go back and rewatch the class. And that's been really helpful for her too. Like I said, the flexibility is incredible, especially when you've got students with some different needs, different concerns in their life, and you're not constantly pulling them in and out of a classroom. So I think for us, that's been probably the biggest thing, the biggest benefit that I didn't even recognize going into this when we first made our decision.
Sure. Ben, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the policy landscape. So obviously this coming school year is going to be unlike anything we've seen, with the exception of probably second semester of last school year. And folks are trying to answer a lot of questions that they've never even had to ask before. Policymakers are having to address issues they've never had to address before, at least in recent times. So what should folks be keeping an eye on going forward in the short term? What sort of policy battles are ahead of us, maybe at the state and federal level? And what's shaping up right now?
Yeah, a lot is shaping up. You've heard the theme from both Leanne and Deana about flexibility and how the different kinds of educational options that they have selected for the needs of their students and their families have provided them that extra flexibility. And I think one thing we learned immediately when this pandemic struck back in March was how much flexibility is lacking in our larger education system. So one of the first things that happened was the Michigan Department of Education sent out a memo in March saying, there are these rules in state law. We must count so many hours that a student is in class, and they call it seat time, that they're learning, right? And since we can't figure out how to count that, their instruction or a recommendation to districts and schools was, we can't really provide instruction. It's not going to count. I mean, you can help them out, but the learning's not going to count because we don't know how to count it. And that right there exposed the lack of flexibility in the system. And one of the big solutions that's come forward to deal with that, at least a step in the right direction, a package of bills that has made its way through the House in Lansing so far and is being considered this week by the Senate. I alluded to it earlier. It really does need to get adopted soon if it's going to have any effect. And it would give local school districts that extra flexibility they need so they can count students learning without having to rely on these rigid hours of learning per year. And it does other things like encourages districts to adopt e-learning days. So maybe it's a pandemic, maybe it's a snowstorm, right? When we were kids, we were always excited when there were 8 or 9 inches of snow on the ground and we listened for the school cancellation. But really with the technology we have available nowadays, kids don't have to be so lucky as that, right? I mean, there are ways, other states are doing it, where they have ways to kind of switch back and forth between traditional classroom instruction and online instruction. And this package of bills is making it easier for districts to do that as well. Excuse me. So what needs to happen, this is just like step one at the state level. And we can get into more of the things that need to happen at the federal level and the state level as well, because what this needs to boil down to ultimately is funding students and not system. But we've exposed that the system is incapable of providing what's needed when something so disruptive happens as a pandemic. And yet we have right now our local and state education officials demanding that you provide us funding and maybe we'll figure out a way to continue your child's education. And that's totally backwards. It's not the way it should be happening. One example, these bills I was talking about were heard before the Senate Education Committee in the last couple of weeks. The state superintendent, Michael Rice, testified during his testimony there. He suggested that the state needs to freeze enrollment. In other words, if a student's district where they live is not providing an adequate education, they should not have the ability to use the schools of choice program or to transfer to an online charter school like the one Deana's daughter attends or anything. We should just freeze the enrollment because we need to preserve the system as it is rather than find ways to help students find more options. And this of course creates all sorts of would create all sorts of bad incentives. Unfortunately, our legislature is not inclined to go that way. But we do know that as this package of bills is being negotiated, the interest groups that are dedicated to preserving the system want to be funded as if they have the same students that were there last year, regardless of the quality of education they're providing. And we're kind of reaching an inflection point where that needs to change. We need to fund students, not systems.
So long term, I don't mean to make you pull out your crystal ball, but long term, what type of policy ramifications are we going to be looking at going forward from here?
Yeah, long term, the education world is shifting rapidly. And I think there are certain things we can talk about that we would like to see happen, even as we try to promote ideas that would build more flexibility into the system, and the system kind of recoils at that. If it stays in that brittle state for too long, it's just going to break itself. And so what we need to do is work to provide, first of all, parents more options. I think one thing we can do at the state level is move toward a competency-based model. And this is long overdue. There have been some districts experimenting with this, but this is basically the idea that rather than fund and advance students based on seat time, in other words, you learn 1 year's worth of material in 1 year, instead of making learning the variable and time the constant, you make time the variable and learning the constant, and you say, help students advance at their own pace. Test them when they master material and help them move forward more quickly, and give them different pathways to get credits toward graduation. So one of the things we would like to see is to take the schools of choice system that we have now and make it universal. In other words, districts right now have the option not to receive students through schools of choice if they want. Famously, districts like Grosse Pointe and Birmingham keep out certain students because they say we don't need them in their funding. We need to create a system that says not only can students have access to other districts wholesale, but especially as they move upward in grade level, and we see that the need for flexibility between in-person and online instruction, they should be able to take a share of their per pupil funding and purchase online courses that help them get, or learning experiences that help them get closer to graduation. And they could get those courses from somewhere outside their district. They could take some of the courses within their district, so the money could be split and the students and families would have power over directing those funds. We've kind of been hoping for some support or some reinforcement from the federal level. You alluded to that earlier. Unfortunately, right now, it's looking like politics is prevailing in DC, and so any attempts at the next round of coronavirus aid is kind of gridlocked. But some of the things that are being talked about that we would think would be beneficial, again, are things that would fund students rather than systems. So 529 education savings plans that parents may be familiar with, you can put money in to save for your child's college education. And as of a couple of years ago, it can also be used for K-12 private school tuition. There should be a move to make those funds also available for parents to help with at-home learning, whether that's a homeschooling experience like Leanne's described or something similar. Education freedom scholarships which would be basically a tax credit program. Donations to that would get a federal tax credit, and if a state like Michigan opted in, then donations could go to fund students' needs, whether it's getting a tutor to help them with reading, or a special needs therapy, or transportation to a career program, or a dozen other things that would help them advance their education, but again, student focused. Or just taking some of the money and giving it directly to parents, like Senator Rand Paul has proposed. All these ideas are out there, and I think the closer we get to the system hitting that breaking point, the more these parents are going to be demanding and seeing as the system resists and listens to interests other than their own, these things are going to become more popular, and we're going to keep advocating for them.
I want to take a little bit of time now to get to some of the questions that we have here. Well, we have a few minutes left, and from William Brown, Ben, I'm going to direct this one to you. Is the State Board of Education requiring schools to provide at least some type of high-quality online learning and experience if they're not going to be doing in-person classroom learning this year? And if not, then why are they not doing that? But I want to ask first, are they in fact requiring that as an alternative?
So if the question is the State Board of Education or state officials requiring high quality online instruction in our public school districts?
In lieu of in-person learning, correct.
In lieu of in-person learning. So yeah, a number of districts like Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Lansing, Walled Lake, Northville, they're all saying we're going to start the school year remote. So there's no in-person option for parents. What metrics do we have to measure the quality of that? Who's demanding it? Right now, we're not seeing any leadership on that front. In fact, what we're seeing from the State Board of Education and superintendent are calls preemptively to waive the standardized tests for a second year, even before the school year starts. And it's totally premature. So we would have no way to measure the quality of online instruction. There are things they could do, which would be, they could have used some of the federal coronavirus relief funds to promote professional development for teachers from groups that, like the Florida Virtual School, or some of our state's cyber school operators who have experience with online instruction, to facilitate training so our teachers would be more up to speed on it's different than an in-person instruction. That didn't happen. So we're kind of left with just the status quo, unless this Republican bill package, the Return to Learn package, passes. One of the things that it would at least require is a benchmark test at the beginning of the school year, so that all students we would find out how much learning they lost from last spring in math and reading, and that would at least create a baseline for us to talk about why we need to keep focus on quality. But right now, until that legislation passes, we've not seen any progress.
Ronald Madreski writes that there has always been a lot of discussion about how school is delivered, whether that's public, private, charter, homeschool, religious schools, and now we have online schools, but very little policy discussion on the content of education and what should be taught for the future, not in the past. And why is that? First, Deana, I want to ask you, in shifting your daughter from the school she was in before to the virtual academy she's in now, did you notice any type of content difference in the curriculum and what was being taught at all?
We had we noticed a little bit of slight difference in math. She just was paced a little bit differently, but in working closely with Highpoint, what we ended up just doing is kind of rearranging. We realized that some of her math didn't line up. And so that first semester, we added in a special math class and pushed something out a year. But it was very quick and easy to do. Honestly, I spend less time with her helping as a parent in the online environment than I did in the public school environment, quite a bit less, because I was having to learn the material myself to try to help her, where, like I said, since we've been online and in charter school, I just can't even say enough good about how much better I feel like her education is now. and more kind of tailored to her than I could get in a public school. There was, the public school teachers just, I don't feel like have access to the same tools. And obviously, and Leanne, you've all said it, to shifting the mindset is probably the most, the most critical thing any parent can do, is because we all have a traditional view of school based on how we all learned. And I agree. I was shaking my head constantly when Leanne was speaking, because, even her approach to learning, that was hard too. I was a little surprised at first too that we didn't have a full 6 or 8 hour day every day in online, but that flexibility has been so positive for our daughter.
Ben, do you agree that there isn't as much policy conversation around content and curriculum as there is over just the institutional structure itself? If so, why do you think that's the case? If not, elaborate a little bit more on where you see that in the policy discussions.
Yeah. So this comes back to the role of the State Board of Education too. And the state has academic content standards that have been approved in a whole variety of areas that is required under law. And of course, our testing system exists to test students' progress in those content areas. And I think we usually only hear discussions about the effectiveness of content every year when those test score results come out. And we see poor results, especially in upper level math, on the SATs and on the MSTEPs, and what that means for remediation and the need for students to have to take extra classes in college and how much that would cost. And then at the beginning of their career as well, third grade reading, which is so crucial. We talk about the third grade reading failure, but then we don't get into the content as much, even though it's such a crucial metric. And we know, I've written several articles on this. A lot of our teachers just are not trained in the core elements of what we know scientifically is needed for students to learn and master reading skills, especially kids with things like dyslexia. And we can do a lot more focusing on those content areas and the basics. And then I would say for things like social studies and things outside of the kind of the core skills of math and reading, there's more opportunity, I think, for diversity really, and how the curriculum is delivered, whether it's public and private. And there's some basic things kids need to know about U.S. history and civics and Michigan history or whatever, but I think we can use a more diverse approach there, and I think it should be part of the conversation. But I think as long as we leave the same structures in place and require systems to be funded and not students, we're not going to have a really good, robust discussion about the content that students need.
Joe, can I chime in on this question as well?
Yes, absolutely.
I was just going to say that, speaking from experience in terms of the homeschooling and also just even watching people within the public school system themselves struggling with who decides what content is the most important and how do you determine mastery and what is most relevant for long-term learning benefits. I think I get a little nervous when I hear us talking too much about policy related to content. I think while there's certainly a baseline that we want to be able to establish, one of the benefits we've seen in homeschooling is not having to adhere to the content stipulations that the schools lay out for you. Being able to choose and flip around, for example, if in 6th grade my son is more interested in learning in this specific area of science than another, that's okay, that we have that flexibility and that you're actually going to have more options to sort of customize learning in a way that's more meaningful long term. So I think part of the problem with content, Joe, getting to the broader question, is that it's very hard to determine who should decide what the content should be and how we should decide that a student masters it, and which to me points back to the fact that ultimately most parents probably know best if their child has mastered something and is headed on the right trajectory. So just having that choice, having that flexibility, having more power given to parents, I think all kind of points in the right direction there.
Yeah, absolutely, Leanne. And Rich Weber wants to know, and so do I, whether there's any medical data being driving these decisions on whether whether schools should be in person or virtual or whatever the case might be right now. He phrased it around the lower risk that we know that younger people have of COVID. And I'd just like to first know, and maybe Ben, I'll direct this at you, is there data driving these decisions right now, or what is the case there?
Right, and I'll begin this with the disclaimer that I'm not a medical or public health expert, and I try to keep up with it as much as the next person. But I think the evidence is that the younger students, particularly in the elementary grades, the evidence is very, very, very much in favor of it not having a great transmission effect through these kids and affecting these kids. So are the decisions being made on that basis? I don't think so. I read an article recently where the strongest correlation on whether schools were opening for in-person instruction or not was not related to the activity of the virus in their area, but was related to the area's political leanings. So I think being an election year has probably taken us away a lot from the science and moved us more into the realm of politics making these decisions. And again, I think the cure for that is to take power away from politicians and put the funds in the hands of families and students.
And Rich, I rephrased that just a little bit to streamline, so I hope that was okay, and I hope you got an answer. And if anybody feels that their question wasn't answered in the way that they asked or didn't get the information they were looking for, please let me know. You can email me at milligan@mackinac.org, and we can get you clarification on anything that you'd like to know. And I want to get to these last few questions with a couple minutes we have remaining. And Zach asks, Michigan's Blaine Amendment prevents state funding in general to private schools. Is there leeway to provide state funding and or federal funding through CARES, GEAR, future federal funding to parents to support their homeschooling efforts? And Ben, I know this is very apropos because we had a recent Supreme Court decision and coming out of Montana in the Espinosa case. So what's the situation currently in Michigan with the Blaine Amendment? And tell us a little bit about that.
Right, so the unfortunate news out of the Espinosa decision was that Michigan, one of a couple states where the Blaine amendments were not struck down. So our Constitution still has that restriction on direct or indirect aid in support of students who would attend a non-public school. I do think this is a very interesting question that Zach is asking because I think I alluded to this earlier. Homeschoolers in particular in Michigan, most of them register. They do not have to register. They just opt out of the system and become homeschoolers. There is an option for homeschoolers to register as a non-public or private school, so their students might be eligible for some special education services or things like that. So the homeschoolers who sign up to be register as a non-public school would probably not be able to get this aid under the Blaine Amendment, but it's an interesting test would be to see whether the other homeschool families would work as a workaround from that Blaine Amendment. I would be willing to give it a try and see. I think a lot of families would benefit from that option, that opportunity, including families who I didn't really get into, but those who are maybe wanting to school at home but a little busy and want to pool together and form something like a pod or a micro school and hire a teacher. And I don't know, but I'm always willing to push the boundaries on those things because I think that's the system, the ways things need to move.
George Nastis III asks, and Leanne, I'm going to direct this one to you. May parents select subjects for their children that may not be available in public schools or decline to expose subjects that are required in public schools that parents may not want their children exposed to? That's a great question. Talk a bit about the flexibility parents have with the curriculum and what you can teach your children there.
Sure, excellent question. And so for the grades of kindergarten through 8th grade, Michigan has a legal requirement that you need to be teaching them 5 or 4, depending on how you parse it, 4 subjects. So you are required to teach reading, you are required to teach math and science and social studies, and they also have a writing component in there. Often the reading and writing get rolled into one. Within that boundary, however, you have choice to select historical fiction books that you want your child to read, or time periods of history, the mathematical progression. They certainly offer guidelines of how to move through, and any curriculum you select will have some age-appropriate guidelines for you. But yes, you do have a lot of freedom over how to tailor your child's education. We've taken advantage of that. When it comes to high school, you will have some additional requirements, obviously, for the Michigan Department of Education to parallel a high school degree. And so there are additional credit hours and subjects that you need to add in the areas of civics and history and government. There's some foreign language, some type of an arts credit, and things of those nature. But within those subjects, if I'm understanding your question correctly, yes, you do have a lot of oversight into letting your child's interests lead where you take that.
And just very quickly, we have one last question that I think transitions really well into wrapping things up. And again, Leanne, I'm going to direct this one at you. And if Ben or Deana, you have any thoughts on this as well, please chime in. And Debbie Kriske, Debbie, I hope I pronounced that correctly. My granddaughter is starting kindergarten and now is being forced to start school online. How and where do we find a homeschool mentor in our area, as I do not personally know of anyone homeschooling?
That's a great question, Debbie. So I will first say I'm happy to talk with you offline if that's an option that you would need. But I would also say that if you look up homeschooling groups in your area, you can often find people who are near you. And I would also say to take advantage of the same virtual landscape that is out there. There are many homeschooling groups that you could probably contact and ask to be linked up with a homeschool parent. And I think you'll find right now that most of us in the homeschooling environment are doing our very best to try to help others understand how to move forward and to feel some confidence and some comfort as they do.
And with that, we are out of time, but thank you so much to our panelists. Ben, Deana, Leanne, thank you so much for joining us here for a little bit of time and offering your expertise to everyone. Thank you for that. And thank you to our Mackinac Center supporters who are on this event. And just a quick reminder that the Mackinac Center is a tax-deductible 501c3 nonprofit, and we are supported exclusively by the generosity of our donors. If you are a donor and you'd like to increase your giving, or you're not yet a donor, we'd love to have that conversation with you. You can do that by going online to mackinac.org, or better yet, just give me an email, Milligan, Milligan, at mackinac.org. And if you enjoyed this event and would like to tune into our next one, that is going to be on August 18th. That's again a Tuesday at 11 a.m. and we'll be discussing Governor Whitmer's unconstitutional executive orders. That sounds like one you're not going to want to miss, but hope to see you then. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.